Can Warhammer 40,000 support any more new factions? Hey guys, Jay here, welcome to Eons of Battle, and today I want to talk about some ideas I have for new factions in Warhammer 40,000. Now typically my answer to this question is no, there's no more room for any factions. There's so many factions for Warhammer 40K that it's absolutely ridiculous. Some things like the Eldar are barely being taken care of, like they still have miniatures from 20, 30 years ago, and then you got some factions that are beyond up to date, like Space Marines, who get a new Primaris Lieutenant Captain every single week. But I think there is some room. Having the squats just come back to the world in the form of the Leagues of Votann, Games Workshop actually did a really good job of reintroducing them to the lore in a way that makes perfect sense as to why they've sort of been gone or why nobody really knows a lot about them, while giving them plenty of room to exist currently and giving them room to expand into the future. Like, after reading the Squat Codex, they give a little blurb about, it's just a little throwaway line in the Codex about how sometimes the Votann, the AI that actually controls their civilization, every now and then it can actually jump into a robotic body and become like a giant mech suit. That's gonna be a model someday, and I am very excited for it. And so I think there's room. I think there's room for some more factions in Warhammer 40,000. I've got a little list starting at the least likely, just is not gonna happen, and ending with the probably sure things. I say sure things, is any of this at all likely? It could totally happen where we never ever get another faction for Warhammer 40,000, and it could happen where we get one every couple of years. We've only once gotten a brand new faction for Warhammer 40,000, and that is the Adeptus Mechanicus, which frustratingly came out in 7th edition as Codex Skitarii and then Codex Adeptus Mechanicus. We had never gotten miniatures from them before. There was a smattering of them in Rogue Trader, but they were never even really an army. They were just things meant to be brought alongside, like Rogue Traders and stuff. Squats and Genestealer cults were playable factions in 1st and 2nd edition, I believe, and then they were gone, squatted, you could say, and then returned triumphantly. And actually, the Sisters of Battle were on the verge of getting squatted for almost 20 years before they got a range refresh in 2019. So I have high hopes for some of the things on this list. Starting with Zote / independent humans and aliens. This is something that actually does exist a lot in Warhammer 40,000, and you see it here and there in the novels, because basically in the world of Warhammer 40,000, it's the same rules as Star Wars. Every single planet is Earth, with its own civilization and aliens and stuff going on. So it could totally happen that we get some sort of a Zote empire or a human empire or even a conglomeration kind of like the Covenant from Halo, just a whole bunch of aliens working together to eke out an existence in the world of Warhammer 40,000. I would probably guess that this wouldn't happen that way that I've just described it, because it's kind of stepping on the toes of the Tau, who in theory are also a conglomeration of different alien species all working together for the greater good, although currently the only thing that exists is the Vespids and the Kroot, who are also barely ever, and nothing ever happens for them in the world of Warhammer. It's pretty much just the Tau show. Squats, on the other hand, would be kind of interesting, and we have seen them appear here and there, most recently in Blackstone Fortress, the board game that Games Workshop made. And originally their lore was that they were an offshoot of the Tyranids, kind of in the same way that Genestealers are sent ahead of the Hive Fleet to talk to other races and kind of get everybody primed for the Tyranid invasion. And I think it'd be really interesting if the Zotes were actually, they kept some of that lore, that they're a piece of the Tyranids, and that they actually have gained sentience and have distanced themselves from their origin species, the Tyranids. And so now they actually have consciousness and free will and their own thoughts and processes about things. And so I think that there is room to have the Zotes maybe allied in with the Tau. I can't quite imagine them as their own faction, especially because they're so weird. They're like crocodile centaurs. So Zote / humans is something I would love to see in Warhammer, but I can't quite picture it in the world of Warhammer as a full faction right now, and there's no real evidence that Games Workshop sees any reason to do such a thing either. Coming in at number 2, which is ever so slightly more realistic than number 1, Chaos Beastman. Now, we just saw Chaos Beastmen come out, actually 2 instances of Beastmen coming out recently, once in Blackstone Fortress, I believe there are 4 Beastmen miniatures, and in the new Kill Team Beastmans. They got a little bit of new lore, and they're sort of chaos, but they're also sort of not chaos. They're not chaos in the way that a lot of the chaos things like Chaos Space Marines are in Warhammer 40,000, where they've discovered their favorite chaos god and they cosplay as their favorite color. But instead, they just kind of worship chaos as an idea or as a being, as its essence in the warp. And they actually make their herd stones, which are these giant monoliths that they pray to, which they cover in blood and bones and weapons and feces, which is a lovely little tidbit from the lore that I really, really enjoy. The Beastmen did exist in Rogue Trader, so there is precedent for them to make a return to Warhammer 40,000, and there was available models to take Beastmen Imperial Guard guys. So Beastmen wearing flak armor and carrying lasguns. So there's a little nugget there for the Beastmen to make a return. If they were to make a return though, it's hard to imagine like Beastmen, many different squads of Beastmen infantry, Beastmen light vehicles, medium vehicles, and heavy vehicles, and special units. What I would think they would do is mutants. In the world of Warhammer, there's billion, trillion, quadrillion human beings, and every now and then one of them is born mutated, where they have just crazy fantasy mutations, wings, claws, looking like a goat. And so I think that would be one way to actually make them their own faction and have a lot of wiggle room for different things. Like you can have a squad of beastmen, you can have a squad of 6-armed humans, you could have a squad of giant like ogrins with crocodile faces. You could do all sorts of interesting things if you kind of brought them all together, because even though these mutant humans are still regular humans, they're not bad folks, they're very poorly treated by the Imperium at large, and so usually they do find their way to chaos because they're just not at all welcome in the Imperium. So I think that would be an interesting way to do it, and it would actually tie in decently with the world of Warhammer and live as their own faction. Is it likely? Probably not. A little bit more than Zote, but a little bit less than the next thing on the list. Coming in at number 3, Eldar Exudites. Now, Eldar Exudites is a little piece of lore from back in the day. It is a group of Eldar who saw the fall of the Eldar coming. Of course, the Eldar, after the Necrons went to sleep and after they defeated the Krorks, which later became the Orcs, they all partied so hard that they created the god Slaanesh and doomed their entire race and maybe the galaxy in general. But the Exudites kind of saw it all coming, and so they decided to kind of become Amish. They decided to retreat to planets that they colonized, and they kind of live a lot more primitive lives than the rest of the Eldar. And so they ride dinosaurs, they have more simple armor and weapon systems, and they kind of just live peaceful lives. And I think that would be a really, really cool way to also make the Eldar maybe a little bit more interesting than they currently are, because I would guess that Eldar is one of the less popular races in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Games Workshop seems to think so because they never ever come out with new models for the Eldar. They've gotten like a tiny, like maybe 5 models over the last 20 years, where other things like the Orcs and the Space Marines and the Necrons are really really taken care of. I think the Necrons got like 13 new units at the start of 8th edition, or maybe 8th edition. And so the Eldar could definitely use some help. I think the Exudites would actually make a wonderful faction, and there are a bunch of people out there who have kitbashed and converted their own Eldar Exudite models and just used the regular Eldar and Dark Eldar rules, but I do think they could stand as their own faction. Barring their own faction, I think that they would be a great thing to bring to the regular Eldar range, just to flesh it out a little bit more. It would be very similar to the Beast Nagas with the Orcs, because the Beast Nagas are kind of their own thing. They're also a little bit of a more primitive Orcs. They have hog riders and giant squigs dragging their war machines into battle. They have a very different aesthetic to the other Orcs, and I really, really like that because it lets you kind of live within faction, but play it very differently. Somebody who goes, very mechanized Orc is probably not gonna have a lot of Beast Nagas, but somebody who really likes like Green Tide or just Horde Orcs, they might wanna move a little bit more into the Beast Naga territory. And so I think a very similar thing could happen with Exudites. If you don't want to go a lot of Wraith, maybe you go really hard into Exudites. I think it would be a really cool thing to see back in Warhammer 40,000 and give a great excuse to get some Eldar models of riding laser dinosaurs, which would be really, really cool. And they pop up pretty darn often in the lore. I mean, probably more often than regular Eldar pop up just because they're Eldar plus. They're Eldar plus dinosaurs and spears and bow and arrows, as opposed to just regular Eldar who are just kind of dour. They're just kind of sad, maybe because their civilization is slowly coming to an end. Eldar Exudites, I think that there's a good chance of seeing them make a return. One faction I could totally see making a grand return to Warhammer 40,000 is Traitor Guard. Everybody loves the Traitor Guard, and they're a really big, important thing in the world of Warhammer. Literally half of the Space Marines turned to Chaos and are now like the biggest threat the Imperium is facing. But along with that, half of the Guard also is traitorous. They have gone to Chaos or have just gone Renegade, have gone Rogue, and are now working against the interests of the Imperium or just trying to eke out a living on their own, not attached to the horrible awfulness that is the Imperium of Mankind. They have had their own models before. they have and sort of still do have their own rules. Forge World used to sell a whole bunch of Traitor Guard models, including some really cool Ogryn miniatures. And currently, there is the Blooded Kill Team, which is Traitor Guard, and those miniatures do have rules for Warhammer 40,000 proper. Kind of along the similar lines of Cultists. I don't know if they're too much better or worse than those, but Traitor Guardsmen would be an army that would be really easy to do, and I think that's another reason that we're definitely going to see them make a return to Warhammer 40,000. They need some new infantry, some new characters, maybe like a chaotic Ogryn squad, but then for the vehicles, they can pretty much just take the regular Imperial Guard vehicles and port them right over into a Traitor Guard Codex. Maybe just one extra sprue full of spikes, and then you've got the whole army ready to rock and roll. And it would give people who don't necessarily want to play Chaos Space Marines, but want to play Chaos, an opportunity to do that with the Traitor Guard. They're a big thing in Warhammer 40,000. They've existed before, and not that long ago, like within the last decade, and I definitely think they'll make a comeback. And similarly to the Traitor Guard, we also will probably see the Dark Mechanicus. Vishtor, the new big chaos baddie, is literally like the patron saint, the evil patron saint of evil machines. He's awesome, and I think he is going to be the flagship of a Dark Mechanicus force at some point. Very similarly to the Imperial Guard, I think that the Dark Mechanicus could just port over a whole bunch of miniatures from the regular Mechanicus range, and then just flesh it out with some more like troops and chaotic spiky bits. Another really easy faction to bring in, and I think it'd be a really good move for the Chaos Space Marines because the Chaos Space Marine vehicles are in a weird place where they're just completely all over the place. Space Marine vehicles are pretty streamlined. You've got your transports, your transport that's been replaced with a gun. You've got a small flyer, a small flyer, a medium flyer, and a heavy flyer. You get the Land Raider. It all sort of makes sense from a Battlefield's perspective. But then when you hop over to Chaos, you've got like laser blaster dinosaurs, 2 different versions of mechanical spiders. You've got the Helldrake. You have all of this chaos shenanigan weirdness that doesn't really feel like it fits in the Chaos Space Marine range. You've just got some Terminators, and then standing next to Terminators is a dinosaur. It does feel a little bit weird, and I could totally see them maybe, as they've continued to make the 4 unique Chaos Space Marine armies. You've got the Slaanesh army, the Tzeentch army, the Khorne army, and the Nurgle army. Those can kind of be your Chaos Space Marines, and then you have the normal Chaos Space Marines, which is essentially just Black Legion, regular Space Marines. And then maybe some more of the units that don't quite fit can be moved into a Dark Mechanicus faction, and then you'd have 6 really strong Chaos factions that make sense, as opposed to the kind of hodgepodge that Chaos has become over the last 20 years. If you look at some of the original Chaos codexes, it all makes a little bit more sense because often they were the same Space Marine miniatures, just with more stuff glued onto them. Where nowadays, Chaos is this weird mixture of punk rock, body horror, and spikes. I don't know, I think Games Workshop is doing a good job of slowly kind of solidifying Chaos into an army that sort of makes a little bit more sense, and I think the last thing to do would be to make the Traitor, the Dark Mechanicus, and just have your, essentially kind of along the lines of the Imperial Guard, just have your dark, evil machines. And maybe they can even make some more Dinobots and actually have a good excuse for why they're so evil looking, because some of the original Rogue Trader artwork for the Mechanicus shows them as very inhuman, with like animalistic faces and these bodies made of wires and cords and cabling. And most of that was kind of done away with to keep a more human form to the Adeptus Mechanicus, which I think is a good move because the Adeptus Mechanicus love the human form and despise AI. And so it makes sense for the Dark Mechanicus to really move away from the human form and embrace like the evil and the machine and the AI. And so I think that would be a really good way to have them both very separate, but similar. And so I think the Dark Mechanicus is another sure thing that we're gonna get from Warhammer 40,000 one of these days. And I also have one honorable mention that I see pop up all the time. People leave this comment all the time, and it is 40K Skaven. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's kind of a neat idea, and I've seen some people do some really cool Skaven converted armies for like Chaos Space Marine and Guard, but I really don't see it happening. Kind of along the lines of Space Seraphon. I think that they exist really well in Age of Sigmar and Old World, but they don't really fit in with Warhammer 40,000. They don't have the right vibe, and I think Games Workshop could invest like writing and storytelling into them and sort of get them there. But I think that they would just kind of step on the toes of other factions. Like if we take the Seraphon from Age of Sigmar and try to put them into Warhammer 40,000, they're very similar to the Necrons in that they have technology that's so advanced it appears like magic. That's just the Necrons. And if we look at the Skaven, they are chaos worshipping little buggers, and that's kind of just the Traitor Guard. And so it would take a lot of work to make them into something that's really, really unique. And if they made them that unique, they probably would be fairly unrecognizable as their original fantasy counterparts. So that's just kind of my thoughts on porting directly over Warhammer Age of Sigmar factions into the world of Warhammer 40,000. I do think that 40K is getting a little bit stuffed, but I think part of the reason why 40K is such an enduring franchise is that there are so many different factions. No other, I don't think, game has 40 plus factions that are all pretty darn playable. And I think it's a really, really impressive thing that Games Workshop has made. Almost as impressive as our Patreon. Over there, we have a new STL train pack every single month, and this month we have the Gothic Modular Trenches, a trench network that can crisscross the battlefields of large-scale games or skirmish games. We also make one episode of Eons of Battle every single week where we take a look at our viewers' miniatures and give some ideas and critiques of how to improve their painting. We host live Discord hangouts, and we have a tier where you can get your name on one of my Black Templar Space Marines and you can join the crusade. We're also streaming on Twitch 2 nights a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 5:30 to 8 p.m. Central Time. I've poo-pooed the idea of new 40K factions in the past, and I do think that 40K is at a really good spot right now, but it is really fun to think about and to come up with ideas of how they could introduce new factions into the lore, and I bet we get a couple more over the next decade. Thanks for watching.